Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. Today, we welcome L-Mani Viney, who is a national thought leader in education, mentoring, and youth advocacy. Mr. Viney, welcome to Instruction Discussion.
Thank you, Kevin.
Before we actually get into today's class, so to speak, let's find out a little bit more about you. What got you into education and how you developed the passion that you currently have?
That's an interesting question. I think it's always been in my DNA, and I'll be honest. It really wasn't until my senior year in college that I said that I would end up going into education. I had tried to avoid it for a long time because I come from a family of educators. My mother, my father, my mother is still a teacher. She's been teaching since 1968. My father was a long-time 3-decade educator. My uncle is superintendent of schools. My other uncle was the executive director of the Boys and Girls Harbor in New York, and aunts and everyone else. So I come from a family of educators, and I had tried to go a different route, but it just kept coming back that this was just a thing that just felt so naturally and for me. So I just said, okay, let's do it.
Your blood. So I mean, yeah, fight it, right?
Right.
So since you have this deep-seated background in education and like I said, you have this passion, because just for full disclosure for everybody listening, we go back relationship, fraternity relationship, and we run in a lot of the same circles and have a lot of the same ideologies when it comes to education and mentoring and so forth. So what do you see as some of the leading issues today in education, especially as it relates to students of color?
Ooh, I think the first one is one of the more broader problems systemically in education. And it's that we factor student management over student development. I think that that's critical, and I know people want to get into the context of race, but when you got to look at any of your core systems, a lot of times they take on broader practices. And I think most school districts practice student management rather than student development. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the data a lot of times, if you look at the demographics, socioeconomics, you can go back 30, 40 years. The outcomes that children have are literally the same based on their socioeconomic status. And so if you're saying that this is what happens to the majority of, we're not talking about that one unique kid, right? We're not talking about the one they make a movie about. What we're saying is that if demographic X has this socioeconomic status, then here are the things that they're going to encounter, do, and be produced throughout their entire K through 12 existence. That data has not really changed over the past 40, 50 years. So why is that? It's because we are in the business right now of managing the student through their 4 years. I'm talking on the high school level, but even on the K through 12, rather than development. And that's critical because managing means that we're more content driven, whereas development means our curriculum is dictated by child development. The social and emotional, I know those are key words people like to use, but it's driven more by that. So now when you take the factor of what it is to be a Black or Latino student and the unique experience there, or Native American or whichever, when you now take that in, Because it's student management, we're simply managing you through your experiences. We're not developing. So therefore, we're not taking in consideration in our curriculum what it is to be a young Black male faced with trauma, what it is to be a young Latino female faced with trauma, which is why in many school districts, we're talking about adding more teachers or adding SROs, yet we have no child psychologists. Yet we have no trauma-informed team. We're not even trauma-informed cultures and even if we do, it's coming from a Eurocentric model that has proven over and over again to not tend properly to the needs of young people of color.
Right. And like I said, we come from a very similar mindset here. And so what I'm thinking is, in hearing you speak, is I had a guest on a while ago, and we spoke about how our school systems are built on basically they're systems of forgetting as opposed to systems of learning. Because what happens when students go in and learn material, or they just learn it for the test? They learn it just long enough to take their test. Then as soon as the test is over, it's done with. And that kind of goes in line with what you're saying as far as being systems of management, because what are school systems designed for? They're designed for students to take these tests so that the schools can look better, not necessarily the individual student can look better, but so that the schools can look better. And I think that goes perfectly in line with what you're talking about here. So what are some of the things that can be done to help shift or start to get people to think about shifting those funds so that we can get those the psychologists and other aspects, other people who can actually help our students to get through some of the issues that they're going through?
So I think there's a two-part, it's actually a three-part, but I want to leave the third part out, which is lobbying on the federal level. But let's set that aside. Mm-hmm. Let's just go directly to where the money really comes from, state and local. I think it's critical that communities demand from their boards of education that funding be shifted towards increasing the number of school psychologists and training of staff and training of the entire district, including the superintendent, to shift into a more trauma-informed school. I also think that needs to be done through the state, because we know that the state also doles out a significant amount of dollars when it comes to school districts. And almost akin to a Title I, you almost need a separate bucket that says, okay, this is for the mental health and wellness of our students. This is especially important when you're talking K through 8. Because we know that the younger you are, the more traumatic experiences that a child has, the more they may have cognitive or delays in cognitive development during that time and even later on. So when we're looking at, quote unquote, the troubles that a child may have academically, especially when we get to high school, because that's when we really start paying attention to grades. What we may not realize is that quote unquote learning disability, that issue, may not actually be because of their intellectual level. But if that child is coming from poverty, they may have had enough traumatic experiences to whereas that's the rooted factor of it, and that there were no interventions or development. So I think you have to funding, and it has to be driven by real proven practices that's out there. The American Black Psychologists Association, ABPSI, has tons of that. Even the APA has tons of it. There's enough psychologists, enough people in the practices that can help really put forth that argument in the shifts. The last thing I'll say on that is, especially on a younger level, I think the other practice is superintendents, principals, I think have to be more looking at how we evaluate our classrooms more in terms of healthy social interactions between children and between children and teachers, and letting that rather than simply the academics be the driver. Now, anybody listening may say, Well, isn't the academics going to fall off if you start having kids do more social and more fun stuff? No, and actually it's proven it's going to be the opposite. The more, the healthier and more positive the environment, the more children now have a comfortability of learning. So you'll actually see grades go up.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's why you see a lot of schools and a lot of teachers shifting to the gamification, because they're trying to make learning more exciting, more fun.
Right.
And because when do students actually enjoy school? When they're in those younger years, kindergarten,
Correct.
grade, that's when they enjoy it. And then as they get older, their interest and their love, their passion for school starts to drop. And that seems to go hand in hand and coincide with this management that takes place now. You're listening to Discussion, the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is L-Mani Viney. And, I do have to go through a quick introduction, let everybody know who you actually are, because I failed to do that earlier on. But aside from being this national thought leader in education, L-Mani has been an educator, basically at the secondary level, which he alluded to earlier, for over 23 years. We already mentioned he has teaching in his blood. Currently, he's a dean of students at a major high school in New Jersey, but a lot of his ideas, of course, do translate throughout the country. In addition, he is the past executive director of the Kappa Alpha Psi Foundation and served as the fraternity's National Guide Right Chairman, transforming the core program, Kappa League, into the largest youth leadership program for African American boys in America. He has spoken and advised numerous organizations such as Mentor, the Congressional Black Caucus, National Association of College Admissions Association, the NEA, College Board, Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, National Council of Black Social Studies, and the Obama Foundation, MBK. So we know those are your credentials. That's where you come from, and that's what is very impressive for everyone. Let's get down to a little bit more of the nitty gritty now, because we spoke. I alluded to your involvement with Kappa Alpha Psi, of course, which I'm a member as well, and the mentoring aspect that comes along with it through Guide Right Kappa League. Let's talk about how do we think mentoring, or what role can mentoring play in supporting not only the academic achievement of students, but also the trauma-informed achievement of those students?
I think it plays a huge role. I think, over the years, and, we've known each other for over a decade now. My thoughts about mentoring just in general keep evolving. And as they keep evolving, I'm finding that mentoring is far more activist in its intentionality than feel good. I think we've oftentimes, just in general, the practice of mentoring has been something feel good. But when you think about the question you just raised, it's really more activist, because you're really asking this question: who is the person that I'm mentoring? Who am I producing? What is that person I'm putting out into the world? And so therefore, when you look at the landscape, if you're talking about young Black males, you have to say to yourself, what is this young Black male going to be when they get out there? What is the impact that they are going to bring to the world? And then what is my role? Now, this is the reason why I said that, because now you have to take serious the questions you just asked. Let's go right to trauma. If you are a mentor of an African-American male that's growing up in a highly violent community, taking them out for ice cream and for a movie and a simple smile is not going to change their life, right? You have to, one, overall practice consistency in communication, practice listening, practice empathy. But you also have to study, how can I help someone that may be feeling in trauma? You have to know your limitations, but once again, you have to know the seriousness in which to take this into patients. And the biggest thing is, know that it's not about you. A lot of times in mentoring, what ends up happening is the mentor thinks it's about them. Oh, the reason why this kid's not responding is because they don't like me and I'm not the hero that I thought, not realizing that a lot of our kids have these deeper things going on. And sometimes as the mentor, sometimes it's not your words they need to hear. Sometimes you have to understand that sometimes you have to be a facilitator. And what I'm saying is that if you are dealing with, let's say you're dealing with a student that has suicidal thoughts, you have a mentee that has suicidal thoughts. Unless you're a psychologist, you are not qualified to tell that student how to navigate. But what you can do is say, help the parent find resources, help the young person find resources. Maybe the best mentoring you can do is walk with your mentee to the psychologist's office, or know that, hey, let me find you a Black psychologist and a Black male psychologist, right? So mentoring plays a role. Now, I will say that that's on the extreme. But if you want to go even on the basics of mentoring, it's proven that kids, especially at a younger age, and then in the adolescence, look up to their mentor, want to be like their mentor. And so how much of your world are you also bringing them into? How much are you making it realistic? How much are you making it the norm? Because even if a kid is going through trauma, they're going through trauma because of the way they see their world and because they believe that is the only world they will have. The mentor has to normalize the alternative. And I think this is critical. This is what I'm saying. A lot of times what the mentor does is meet the child on neutral ground. Ice cream, movies, blah, 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 blah. But they don't bring them into their world. Now, you and I are educated Black men. There's a world we live. There's a world that a number of Black people are living that there are some Black children, the way they're growing up, don't even believe it exists. And we're not even talking about living in mansions and cars with Rolls Royces. We're talking about even just the basic suburbs or basic house, front yard, backyard, right? Even in this day, mentors often don't bring the kids into the world. You have to bring your kid into that world, bring your kid into that profession so that they can normalize the other side of the world so that they can see that you don't have to just stay in an environment of trauma. To me, that's what mentors need to do. Now, the last thing I'll say is this. I think we let mentoring organizations off the hook because I think it's also it's the bigger responsibility of any mentoring organization to to understand the weather and what the demographic of kids are going through and make sure they're providing both training and proper resources to the mentors. So I think that's critical also.
And I think that's where, from listening to you speak and how the whole idea of mentoring has evolved over time, I think what you started to touch on is it starts to become coaching.
Yes.
Because now what you're talking and I think the difference between mentoring and coaching, was what you hit on, is mentoring is really guiding the individual from the perspective of the mentor. So if I'm the mentor, I'm guiding you based on my experiences.
Right.
As opposed to coaching, I'm really guiding you based on what you need.
Exactly.
What your needs are and supplying you what you need. It's like like Serena Williams. We know how great a tennis player she is. She has a coach. And it's not because that coach is necessarily better than she is, but it's somebody who's going to be able to read and understand what her needs are and be able to supply her with what she needs to get better. And I think that's where you're going, where the evolution of mentoring has to go into, where we have to kind of identify what the needs are of the mentee and then supply them with those needs in order to be successful.
Right. And even to take you a step further, because you're absolutely right on that. What's interesting is that the practice of mentoring is actually two different philosophies. There's a Western philosophy and there's an Eastern philosophy. The Western philosophy comes from the Greek mentor, who and he does that, and I forgot the name of the father, but the father went off to war, and he left his son with the person mentor, and that was nurturing, right? What's interesting though is that the real practice of mentoring actually exists hundreds of years prior to on the eastern side amongst the Chinese dynasties, to whereas it was about finding the child and cultivating the next emperors of China. And now this is why that's important, because if you look at Eastern philosophy, a lot of that, when they talk about the tales of bringing someone into power, there was someone old and wise that served as the mentor. But from what you're saying, coaching, right, the Serena Williams, identifying the potential of greatness, the potential of impact within the child, the person, and helping to bring that out, right? What Western philosophy does is look at the child in a deficit-based view and say, here's what's wrong with you and what can we prevent? So Western philosophy is more prevention. Let me prevent you from going to jail. Let me prevent you from dropping out. Eastern philosophy is literally like, you could be the greatest emperor of all time. Let me pull that out of you. Let me cultivate that.
Right. And I think that goes back to the old argument, is it nature versus nurture? So right. Are you predestined to go a particular route, or can you be guided to become something greater than what you are? So I think these are very important distinctions that we definitely need to make a note of, and so forth. We can go forward with these particular ideas. So let me ask you this now. We know how technologically advanced we're supposed to be, and how education is really moving into a more technology-driven realm. What role do you think technology is going to have on this changing education landscape? And how do we address home access concerns?
So let me go to the last question, because I think the last question is the easiest. I think you have to do an assessment of, when you look at what happened this year. Number one, you got to start with your empirical evidence. Okay, what went right? What went wrong? And now you have to look at it from a facility standpoint. Okay, what percentage of our kids had no problems logging on, was able to stay on? What percentage had difficulty? Then you have to address it. So in my opinion, you have to treat Wi-Fi I'm talking just strictly technological, right? Because there's a bigger issue. But strictly technological, you got to look at it like a classroom. If a student comes into a classroom, a teacher must always make sure that the student has their book. We're going to provide you a book, provide you a notebook, especially you're younger, pencil, pen, right? You got to do the same thing. In this case, you need to make sure, if they can't afford it, they have the proper laptop, not just a laptop, proper laptop, Chromebook. You have to make sure that they have Wi-Fi. If a family cannot afford Wi-Fi, then yes, it should be up to the district or the municipality to make sure that they have access to Wi-Fi. I even think districts may want to look at working with various different cable companies or Wi-Fi companies and just buying a package for all students. Herein lies the bigger problem, though. Go back to I want to be clear. Tell me your first part of that question again.
What do you think the role technology is going to play in the changing educational landscape?
I think it's going to play both good and bad. On the good side, I think it opens up a world of new learning possibilities. For example, I think now you're able to, you look at how we're using Zoom, right? So if you wanted to now teach students about South Africa, you're no longer limited to the textbook. You're no longer limited to a documentary. You can literally now set up a class using Zoom and have it taught to your students by a South African teacher in South Africa, right? And so you actually now have access to the world in a way we didn't think about before. right? We actually have access to cultivate our curriculum to pull from different places in real time and literally say, hey, we're going to bring this into your living room or into your classroom. That's wonderful. That's great, right? Here's the negative. If your district is not about child development, if your district is about student management, if your district is more content driven than understanding your student driven, then you run the risk of reducing your students to names on screens and avatars. If they were invisible, there's already a level of invisibility that children have even sitting in front of you. How many students will say, oh, this is the only teacher? How many times have we heard through decades, this is the only teacher or the only person that cared about me? Well, if you're always saying that, what they're really saying is that 80 to 90% of my other teachers rendered me invisible. I was just a seat in the chair. As long as I did my work and everything, then I was good. So now imagine you're not even seeing them. They're an avatar. They're a name. Make sure you get your work in. Do we know what's going on in that home? Do we? How does the sidebar conversation happen for a child in distress, right? And if we're talking about the issue of poverty, we have to be real here. Poorer communities see higher rates of trauma. That trauma mostly happens. We could talk about the dude that got shot on the block. We can talk about happens in the house. And so the other problem you have is you're now having children that potentially could be learning in the hostile environment, which is the home. And so I think one of the biggest concerns I have is are we going to realize that as critical as it is that we need to streamline our curriculum, are we also putting in place stronger pipelines of outreach and intervention for these children if they're not in school with us? And that's my concern. You know, I'm hearing everybody about technology, but then you're reducing children to data. And the last thing I'll say on this is, and to me, it gets away to the fundamental thing about education, and this is always missed. At its core, education is still about human relationships. It's the thing that's missed. You spend 8 hours of your day interacting with other human beings. You are literally now digitizing that. And if you're not understanding of the dangers of what that can be, you're going to cause problems. You'll get your work in, you'll get that, but how will you know who's suffering? How are you developing? What perspectives? What interactions? And will we see a stagnation of growth from the child? And I know I said my last point, but think about it like this. If you have a student Monday through Friday that's sitting in their chair doing their work, they're getting it in, but let's stop and think. They're sitting in the chair. The only time they're getting up is for lunch from 8 a.m. till 3 p.m. They're sitting in isolation. How are they physically and mentally and emotionally developing? To me, that's stagnation. I think we need to be real concerned about that.
Thank you again for coming on today's show.
Appreciate it. Definitely. Great job. Thank you, Kevin.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College Radio, 90.3 WHPC.